Hello guys. If you like our content and you love scary stories, then subscribe, like, and write in the comments your scary stories so that we write your story. Scary viewing and terrifying sensations to you. The Haunting of Waverly Hills, Echoes of the Forgotten. Part 1, The Arrival. In 1924, Sarah Collins, a 23-year-old schoolteacher from Louisville, Kentucky, was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a disease that had claimed the lives of millions across the globe. With little hope for recovery, Sarah was sent to Waverly Hills Sanatorium, a sprawling Gothic structure perched on a lonely hill outside the city. The sanatorium was considered one of the most advanced tuberculosis treatment facilities of its time, but it was also a place where the dying were sent to await their inevitable end. From the moment Sarah arrived at Waverly Hills, she felt a deep sense of foreboding. The building loomed over her, its darkened windows like the empty eyes of a skull. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and decay, and the sound of distant coughing echoed through the halls. She was admitted to the women's ward on the 5th floor, where the walls seemed to close in on her, and the light barely penetrated the gloom. As Sarah settled into her new life at the sanatorium, she quickly realized that Waverly Hills was not just a place of physical suffering, but of spiritual torment as well. The other patients spoke in hushed tones of strange occurrences, shadowy figures that roamed the halls at night, unexplained cold spots, and the sound of soft, disembodied whispers. The most chilling stories were about room 502, a small, windowless room on the 5th floor where a nurse had hanged herself many years before. At first, Sarah dismissed the stories as the product of fevered imaginations, but it wasn't long before she began to experience the strange phenomena herself. One night as she lay in bed, she felt an intense cold settle over her. She opened her eyes and saw a faint, ghostly figure standing at the foot of her bed, a woman dressed in a nurse's uniform, her face obscured by shadows. Sarah's heart raced as the figure slowly raised a hand, pointing directly at her before vanishing into the darkness. Sarah was too terrified to sleep, and she spent the rest of the night lying awake, her mind racing. She knew that what she had seen was not a dream, but a real, tangible presence. The next morning, she tried to confide in one of the nurses, but the woman simply brushed off her concerns, attributing them to the stress of her illness. But Sarah knew better. Something was haunting Waverly Hills, and it had chosen her as its next victim. Part 2, The Legend of Nurse Mary. As Sarah's condition worsened, she became more attuned to the strange occurrences at Waverly Hills. The ghostly figure of the nurse appeared to her more frequently, always pointing at her with that same bony, accusatory finger. Desperate for answers, Sarah began to ask the other patients about the stories she had heard. One of the older women in the ward, a patient named Margaret, told her the tragic tale of Nurse Mary. According to Margaret, Mary had been a kind and compassionate nurse who had worked at Waverly Hills in the early 1900s. She had fallen in love with one of the doctors, and when she discovered she was pregnant, she was devastated. Fearing the scandal would ruin her career and reputation, Mary took her own life, hanging herself in room 502. The staff had tried to cover up the incident, but rumors spread quickly, and soon, the story of the tragic nurse became part of the sanatorium's dark lore. It was said that Mary's spirit was unable to find peace, and that she continued to haunt the halls of Waverly Hills, appearing to patients who were close to death. Sarah felt a deep sense of sorrow for Mary, but she was also terrified. The visions of the ghostly nurse became more intense, and Sarah began to feel as if she were being watched constantly. She would wake up in the middle of the night to find her room bathed in an eerie, bluish light, and the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and decay. One night, Sarah decided to confront the ghost. She left her room and made her way to the 5th floor, her footsteps echoing in the silent, empty corridors. The hallway was cold and dark, and the only light came from the flickering fluorescent bulbs overhead. When she reached room 502, she hesitated for a moment before placing her hand on the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a small, windowless room. The air inside was musty, and the walls were stained with mildew. In the center of the room, an old wooden chair stood beneath a frayed length of rope that dangled from the ceiling. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she imagined Mary's final moments alone, scared and filled with despair. As she stood in the room, the door suddenly slammed shut behind her, and the temperature plummeted. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She turned around and there was Mary, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes filled with sorrow. The ghostly nurse reached out to Sarah, her hand trembling, and Sarah felt a wave of sadness wash over her. Mary opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, a faint whisper filled the room, a voice that seemed to come from all around her. "Help me," the voice said, echoing in Sarah's mind. "Please help me." Part 3: The Death Tunnel's Secrets. Haunted by Mary's plea, Sarah became determined to find a way to help the tormented spirit. But she was only a patient, weakened by illness, confined to a bed most of the day. How could she possibly free a ghost from its suffering? The answer came to her one night in a vivid dream. In the dream, Sarah found herself standing at the entrance to the death tunnel, a long, dark passageway that ran from the basement of the sanatorium to the bottom of the hill. The tunnel was used to discreetly remove the bodies of those who had died, sparing the remaining patients from witnessing the constant stream of death. In her dream, Sarah walked down the tunnel, her footsteps echoing ominously off the damp, concrete walls. As she reached the end, she saw Mary standing there, her face filled with a silent plea. Sarah woke up with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. The dream had felt so real, and she knew that it was more than just a figment of her imagination. It was a message, a call to action. Mary's spirit was trapped within Waverly Hills, bound to the place of her suffering, and the only way to free her was to guide her through the death tunnel, to release her from the sanatorium's grasp. The next day, Sarah summoned what little strength she had left and made her way to the basement. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and decay, and she felt a deep sense of dread as she descended the stairs. The basement was dimly lit, with flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The entrance to the death tunnel loomed before her, a dark, gaping maw that seemed to swallow all light. Sarah hesitated at the threshold, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with moisture, and the tunnel walls glistened with dampness. She could feel the weight of the sanatorium pressing down on her, as if the building itself were alive, a malevolent force that sought to keep her within its grasp. But she knew she couldn't turn back. Mary was counting on her. As she stepped into the tunnel, the darkness closed in around her, and the temperature dropped sharply. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and Sarah struggled to breathe. She heard strange noises, soft whispers, distant footsteps, and the sound of something dragging along the floor. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending passage into the abyss. But Sarah pressed on, driven by a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. She knew that Mary was with her, guiding her through the darkness. Finally, she reached the end of the tunnel. The exit was blocked by a heavy steel door, but it was slightly ajar, allowing a faint sliver of light to filter through. Sarah pushed the door open and stepped out into the cold night air. She turned around, expecting to see Mary standing behind her, but the tunnel was empty. For a moment, Sarah felt a pang of disappointment, but then she heard the whisper again, this time filled with gratitude. "Thank you," the voice said, and Sarah felt a warm, comforting presence wash over her. She knew then that Mary was finally at peace. The spirit had been released from the torment of Waverly Hills, free to move on to whatever lay beyond. But Sarah's journey was far from over. The encounter in the death tunnel had taken a toll on her, both physically and mentally, and she knew that her own time was running out. Part 4: The Final Farewell. Sarah's health deteriorated rapidly after her encounter in the death tunnel. The doctors were concerned, but there was little they could do. Tuberculosis was a relentless disease, and despite their best efforts, it was clear that Sarah's time was running out. She spent her final days in a small room on the first floor, where she could look out over the grounds and see the sun setting behind the hills. She was too weak to move, too weak even to speak, but her mind was still sharp, and she often thought about Mary and the other souls who had been trapped in Waverly Hills. She wondered how many others had suffered the same fate, how many spirits were still wandering the halls, lost and forgotten. One night, as she lay in bed, Sarah felt a familiar presence in the room. She opened her eyes and saw Mary standing at the foot of her bed, her face soft and serene. There was no longer any sorrow in her eyes, only peace. Mary reached out and took Sarah's hand, and in that moment Sarah felt all of her fear and pain melt away. She knew that Mary had come to guide her, to take her to the other side, where she would finally be free of the suffering that had plagued her in life. The room filled with a soft, warm light, and Sarah felt herself being lifted out of her body. She looked down and saw herself lying on the bed, her face calm and peaceful. She was no longer afraid, no longer in pain. Mary smiled at her, and together they walked into the light, leaving the darkness of Waverly Hills behind. Sarah's body was found the next morning by one of the nurses. She was lying on her back, her hands folded neatly on her chest, a small, contented smile on her lips. The nurse was puzzled by the look of peace on her face, as if Sarah had died not in pain, but in some kind of blissful state. Word of Sarah's death spread quickly through the sanatorium, and the other patients whispered about the strange events that had occurred in the days leading up to her passing. Some claimed to have seen a bright light emanating from her room on the night she died, while others spoke of a warm, comforting presence that had filled the halls. The staff at Waverly Hills tried to dismiss the stories as nothing more than the ramblings of frightened, sick people, but deep down, they knew that there was something more to it. The sanatorium had always been a place of suffering, but for the first time, it seemed as if there was a glimmer of hope, a sense that the spirits of the past could finally find peace. Part 5: The Haunting continues. Even after Sarah's death, the strange occurrences at Waverly Hills continued. The ghostly figure of Nurse Mary was no longer seen, but other apparitions began to make their presence known. Patients reported seeing shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their rooms, and the sound of soft, disembodied whispers filled the air. The most terrifying experiences occurred at night when the sanatorium was plunged into darkness and the spirits seemed to roam freely. One patient, a young man named Tom, was particularly sensitive to the paranormal activity. He often awoke in the middle of the night to find his bed surrounded by dark, indistinct shapes. The figures would move silently around his bed, as if observing him, and then vanish just as quickly as they had appeared. Tom was terrified, but there was little he could do. He was too weak to leave his bed, and the doctors dismissed his experiences as hallucinations brought on by his illness. But Tom knew what he had seen was real. The figures were not just the products of his fevered mind, they were the restless spirits of the people who had died at Waverly Hills, still trapped within the walls of the sanatorium. He could feel their pain, their despair, and it weighed heavily on him. One night, as Tom lay in bed, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching his room. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. It was a man, tall and thin, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. Tom felt a wave of terror wash over him as the man approached his bed. The figure leaned over him, its cold breath brushing against Tom's face. "Help me," the man whispered, his voice filled with desperation. Tom wanted to scream, to run, but his body was paralyzed with fear. The figure's eyes bored into him, and Tom could feel the man's pain, his longing for release. But there was nothing Tom could do. He was as trapped as the spirits, confined to his bed, waiting for the disease to claim him. The figure lingered for a moment longer, then slowly backed away, disappearing into the shadows. Tom lay in bed, trembling, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he had just had a close encounter with the supernatural, and he also knew that the spirits of Waverly Hills were far from at peace. Part 6: The Dark History Revealed. As the paranormal activity at Waverly Hills intensified, a group of doctors and nurses decided to delve into the history of the sanatorium in an attempt to understand the source of the hauntings. What they uncovered was a dark and tragic past, filled with suffering, death, and despair. Waverly Hills had been built in the early 1900s as a treatment facility for tuberculosis patients, but the methods used were often experimental and brutal. Patients were subjected to painful procedures, such as collapsing a lung or removing ribs to allow the lungs to expand. Many of these treatments were ineffective and only served to prolong the patient's suffering. The death rate at Waverly Hills was staggeringly high, with hundreds of patients succumbing to the disease each year. The bodies were discreetly removed through the death tunnel, a dark passageway that ran from the basement to the base of the hill. The staff believed that by hiding the dead, they could keep up the spirits of the living, but the reality was that the sanatorium had become a place of death, where hope was in short supply. But it wasn't just the treatment methods that contributed to the dark atmosphere at Waverly Hills. The sanatorium had also been the site of numerous suicides, most notably that of Nurse Mary, who had hanged herself in room 502 after discovering she was pregnant. There were also rumors of patients being mistreated or even murdered by the staff, their deaths covered up to avoid scandal. The more the doctors and nurses learned about the history of Waverly Hills, the more they realized that the hauntings were a manifestation of the pain and suffering that had taken place within its walls. The spirits of the dead were unable to find peace, their souls trapped in a place of despair. Determined to bring closure to the restless spirits, the group decided to conduct a séance in the death tunnel, hoping to communicate with the ghosts and help them move on to the afterlife. But they were unprepared for the horrors they were about to unleash. Part 7: The Séance in the Tunnel. The séance was held on a cold, moonless night, with the wind howling through the trees and the darkness pressing in on all sides. The group of doctors and nurses gathered at the entrance to the death tunnel, their breath visible in the frigid air. They had brought candles, a Ouija board, and a small table, which they set up in the center of the tunnel. The air was thick with tension as they lit the candles and sat around the table, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The tunnel seemed to swallow the light, and the shadows danced eerily on the walls. The leader of the group, Dr. Jameson, placed his hands on the Ouija board and began to speak, calling out to the spirits of Waverly Hills. At first, there was nothing but silence. The group sat in tense anticipation, their eyes darting around the darkened tunnel. Then, slowly, the planchette on the Ouija board began to move. The group watched in awe and fear as it spelled out a single word: help. Dr. Jameson asked the spirit to identify itself, and the planchette spelled out the name Mary. The group gasped in shock. Nurse Mary's spirit was communicating with them. Dr. Jameson asked what she needed help with, and the planchette spelled out trapped. Suddenly, the temperature in the tunnel plummeted, and the candles flickered and went out, plunging the group into darkness. The air grew thick and heavy, and the sound of soft whispers filled the tunnel, echoing off the walls. The group could feel the presence of the spirits all around them, pressing in on them from all sides. One of the nurses screamed as she felt a cold hand brush against her arm, and the group began to panic. Dr. Jameson tried to calm them down, but it was too late. The spirits had been stirred, and they were angry. The sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel, growing louder and louder until it seemed as if a crowd of people were marching toward them. The group tried to flee, but the tunnel seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing in from all sides. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the sound of wailing filled their ears. They were trapped, just like the spirits they had tried to communicate with. Suddenly, the tunnel was filled with a blinding light, and the group felt a wave of intense heat wash over them. The light grew brighter and brighter, until it seemed to consume everything around them. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving the group standing in the cold, dark tunnel, gasping for breath. They stumbled out of the tunnel, shaken and terrified, their minds reeling from what they had just experienced. The spirits of Waverly Hills had made it clear that they were not to be disturbed, and the group knew that they had come dangerously close to unleashing something far more sinister than they had anticipated. Part 8: The Aftermath. The séance had left the group deeply shaken, and the paranormal activity at Waverly Hills only intensified in the days that followed. The spirits seemed angrier, more restless, and the staff and patients began to experience even more terrifying encounters. One of the nurses who had participated in the séance, a woman named Alice, became particularly affected by the events. She was plagued by nightmares of the death tunnel, where she saw the faces of the dead, their eyes filled with sorrow and anger. During the day, she would catch glimpses of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of her vision, and she often felt a cold, malevolent presence following her. Alice tried to carry on with her duties, but the strain was too much for her. One night, as she was making her rounds, she heard a soft voice calling her name. She turned and saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, a man with hollow eyes and a gaunt face. It was the same figure that Tom had seen, and now it was coming for her. The figure moved toward her, its eyes fixed on hers, and Alice felt her body go numb with fear. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure reached out and touched her arm, and Alice felt a wave of cold wash over her. "Help me," the figure whispered, its voice filled with despair. Alice screamed and fled down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that the figure was one of the restless spirits of Waverly Hills, and that it was seeking release from its torment. But there was nothing she could do to help. She was just a nurse, and the spirits were beyond her control. Over the next few days, Alice's mental state deteriorated rapidly. She became withdrawn, paranoid, and her colleagues began to worry about her. She would often be found staring blankly at the walls, her eyes filled with fear, muttering about the spirits that haunted her. One morning, Alice was found dead in her room, her body cold and lifeless. The cause of death was listed as suicide, but those who knew her believed that the spirits of Waverly Hills had finally claimed her. Part 9: The Abandoned Sanatorium. The death of Alice marked the beginning of the end for Waverly Hills Sanatorium. The paranormal activity had reached a fever pitch, and the staff and patients were living in constant fear. The doctors tried to maintain control, but it was clear that the sanatorium was no longer a place of healing. It had become a place of death and despair. The decision was made to close Waverly Hills, and the remaining patients were transferred to other facilities. The sanatorium was abandoned, left to decay on its lonely hill, a monument to the suffering that had taken place within its walls. But even after the building was abandoned, the spirits of Waverly Hills remained. Local residents reported seeing strange lights flickering in the windows and hearing the sound of soft, disembodied whispers carried on the wind. The death tunnel, once used to discreetly remove the bodies of the dead, became a place of legend where brave souls would dare each other to venture, only to be driven back by the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the air. Waverly Hills became a symbol of the dark past, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead had been blurred. The sanatorium stood as a reminder of the pain and suffering that had taken place there, and the spirits that were still trapped within its walls. Part 10: The Final Resting Place. Many years after Waverly Hills was abandoned, a group of paranormal investigators decided to explore the sanatorium in an attempt to document the hauntings. Armed with cameras, recording equipment, and an array of ghost hunting tools, the group made their way to the decaying building, determined to uncover the truth about the spirits that haunted Waverly Hills. The investigators spent several nights in the sanatorium, and what they captured on their equipment was both terrifying and heartbreaking. Shadowy figures moved through the halls, disembodied voices called out from the darkness, and cold spots appeared and vanished without warning. The spirits of Waverly Hills were still very much present, their pain and suffering etched into the very fabric of the building. But it wasn't just the ghosts of the patients who haunted Waverly Hills. The investigators also encountered the spirit of Nurse Mary. She appeared to them in the death tunnel, her face filled with sorrow, her eyes pleading for release. The investigators knew that they had found the source of the hauntings, the spirit who had been unable to find peace. Determined to help Mary and the other spirits, the investigators held a final séance in the death tunnel. They called out to the spirits, urging them to move on, to find the peace that had eluded them in life. The air grew thick with tension, and the tunnel was filled with the sound of soft, disembodied voices. But this time, there was no anger, no malice, only a deep sense of sadness. As the séance continued, the investigators felt a shift in the atmosphere. The cold spots began to disappear, and the air grew warmer. The shadowy figures faded into the darkness, and the disembodied voices grew softer until they were nothing more than a faint whisper. The investigators knew that they had succeeded. The spirits of Waverly Hills were finally at peace. The building, once a place of suffering and despair, was now just an empty shell, a reminder of the past, but no longer haunted by the souls of the dead. Waverly Hills was left to decay, its walls crumbling, its windows shattered, but the spirits had found their final resting place. The sanatorium, once a place of pain and suffering, was now a place of peace, where the echoes of the forgotten had finally been silenced.